Good morning, California. My name is Lande Ajose, and I'm the Vice President and Walter and Esther Hewlett Chair in Understanding California's Future and Senior Fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Thanks for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this program featuring Michael Tubbs, founder of EPIC, End Poverty in California, and the former mayor of the city of Stockton. Before we jump into our program, I have a few housekeeping items to mention. This event is a part of PPIC's 2022 Speaker Series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. We'd like to thank our sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen as well as on our website. This series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor so that we may continue to make programs like today's possible and ensure that they are free to attend. More information is available at ppic.org. And finally, before we begin, if you have any questions for Michael, please send them an email to the address you see on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'd appreciate it if you would include your name and organization along with your question, and we have 15 minutes at the end of the program to devote to those questions. And now I would very much like to welcome our featured speaker, Mr. Michael Tubbs. Mayor Tubbs, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all the work you do on behalf of California all the time.
Well, always good to be with you, and so good to see you and to be in conversation, particularly with the work PPIC does. So we're looking forward to it.
Thank you. So here's what I have: a million questions literally that I want to ask you, but I thought I would start with the big question because this series is the third in a kind of mini series reflecting on the pandemic. And so I'm curious to know from you, when you look ahead, when you think about California as being poised to turn the corner on the pandemic or enter an endemic, what's the most important challenge to ensuring that we have an equitable recovery for the state?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge before the pandemic as well. I know one you devoted your entire working life to. It's this idea of how do you make visible the invisible struggle of millions of Californians who are in poverty or one paycheck away. It felt like for a brief moment during the pandemic, we all were on the same page about like, wow, like poverty is a public health crisis, that poverty is a pre-existing condition, that we can exist as a nation, but particularly as a golden state with so many people unable to afford housing, so many people without paid time off to shelter in place. And what I hope happens as we rebound from this pandemic is we don't look at sort of the gains at the top as being indicative of a healthy economy, or the gains at the top, or even some gains at the middle, meaning that everything's okay, or that we're going back to what was, because even what was before the pandemic was very precarious. Again, not for a small segment, for between 17 and 33% of Californians who are either in poverty or one paycheck away. So I'm a broken record, but I just really think that is the indicators I look at and what I pay attention to, particularly because we know the next generation of this state are going to be even more diverse, even more folks of color. And we know based off data that our families of color, that are Latino women, that are Black women, et cetera, Native women, Southeast Asian women, et cetera, haven't been made whole. We're in a great position in the pandemic where some of the groups are doing, in some cases, worse. Now that we're beginning to exit out. So I just hope we have a granularity and a focus as to lifting up what's good and what's happening, what's rebounding, but not losing sight of what we need to do.
So let's think about that. I mean, because we've had an uneven recovery in some ways. And so I'm wondering kind of what letter grade would you give California in terms of how it has recovered economically from the pandemic?
Yeah, from the scale of the entire economy being in disarray, from the scale of sort of real fear about what COVID-19 would mean to the industries that help California so much, particularly tourism and hospitality, et cetera, I would say a C plus B minus. And I think the reason why it's a C plus B minus is to the point of it hasn't been an equal recovery. It's been good in the sense that we still have an economy, that we still have industry, that we still have commerce, but it hasn't been good to the fact that we still have folks who can afford housing. Even more so now, we still have millions of women who have left the workforce, who or even if they have left the workforce by choice because of schooling and Zoom and care responsibilities, but also because many of the jobs they work in are now not as plentiful, because as we move to remote and work from home, and it decreases the demand for some of the jobs in hospitality and other sectors that require in person, as those services are being utilized as much. And I think uneven because we know, we see it now with these gas prices and with inflation. If you were struggling before gas was $6, you're not doing better now. If you were struggling before prices for everything went up, you're not doing better now. And that happening at the same time, the federal government's retreating a lot of the life-saving, life-sustaining support that was had during the first 2 years of the pandemic are the reason why I give us a grade that we have. But again, it's to your point, it's just hard because particularly given that we were in the crisis of the pandemic, the temptation is to paint a rosy picture. The temptation is to inspire hope and say, look at us coming back. And in some cases we are, but the reality is there were a lot of people feeling pain before the pandemic. Those same people are feeling pain after the pandemic. And there hasn't been anything meaningful that has bettered their position over the long term and not just through a particular crisis.
So let's complicate the thinking, because one of the subplots of the pandemic was the Great Resignation, which made it appear that, that there was a lot of choice in people's ability to walk away from their jobs. And yet I wonder what this suggests to you about the structure of our economy, the structure of our labor markets. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I remember being in so many conversations about this, particularly when we had the Golden State stimulus and we had the federal stimulus and we had child tax credit and we had unemployment insurance. And people saying, well, this is causing people not to work. But what was actually happening were a couple of factors. Number one, you had people, disproportionately women, who were making choices to leave the workforce out of concern for family, out of concern for their children, out of concern for other caregiver responsibilities that they unfairly shoulder. So you had women who had great jobs, making good money, leaving the workforce. So, I have to make sure my child logs into Zoom every day. You had people who, particularly given the housing costs in California, lived 2 or 3 generations. So are living with grandma and great grandma, and made the smart calculation that their grandmother's life wasn't worth their minimum wage job, that their grandfather's life wasn't worth sort of being put in harm's way during the pandemic, particularly in counties and in places where there was no mask enforcement, where there was really no sheltering in place, where there was unmitigated spread and spikes and things. So I think that's part of it. And part of it, and this is the part I wish we spent more time thinking about, was that folks had agency, right? And we have to really think about our economic system without the supports creates coerced choices where people may have to take jobs that they ordinarily wouldn't have chosen because they aren't safe, or they don't provide good wages, or they don't provide stable hours, or they don't provide sort of benefits, but are coerced to because there's no option and there's no real safety net. But with a safety net, with the ability to say, okay, well, I may not have everything, but I have enough to do what's necessary to survive, then folks were able to make choices about what quality of jobs do they want to take, what type of environment do they want to be in, what type of dignity would they be offered. And that's why we also saw an increase in union organizing, an increase in collective bargaining, and an increase in strikes and things of that sort, because it was the first time workers had a semblance of a foundation to say, well, let's have a conversation if I'm so essential about what I need, in terms of and never anything crazy, but for retail workers, I just need to know my schedule for the week. For caregivers, I just need to be able to afford rent to where I live.
That's interesting, because it sounds like part of what you're saying is that an equitable recovery means having equity and choice, right?
Yeah, I am so enamored with this idea of sort of true freedom is agency. Like if freedom is one of our values as a state, then part of it is giving folks the freedom to choose.
Mm.
And the thing is, some people have that. Like I'm able to choose what type of work I do and don't do. I'm able to choose the conditions in which I work. And there's a lot of people who don't, who are forced to work in dangerous conditions, who are forced to work ridiculous hours, who are forced to work without benefits. And I think what part of this reset has to be us taking stock as to, in a fiscally responsible way, of course, but what work, what is necessary, and what's essential for folks in California to have. So, for example, the legislature, the governor just came up with a compromise around paid family leave, or paid time off, which is a good start, But we also know it left out a whole segment of folks who work in small businesses who are 10, 20 employees or less who weren't part of this agreement. And I think a part of equitable recovery is saying, we did it for these folks. What can we do? What can we do for these folks that were left out? Like, how do we figure out the revenue? How do you figure, so to answer the theme
Mhm.
is that for me, an equitable recovery is about providing people agency, but it's also about really taking stock as to sort of what were we able to do during an emergency, and realizing that poverty, economic insecurity is an ongoing state of emergency. So how do you keep those things in place? Like, it makes no sense to take them away when folks still aren't better off than they were when they started this process 2-3 years ago.
So can you point us to one or two or maybe three things that you think state policymakers should be doing right now to ensure that our economic recovery is equitable? Like,
Yeah,
what are the top things for you, at least, that you would have state lawmakers take on?
yeah, and I'm laughing because I know a lot of them are tired of me in a good way. Because I'm just like, look, y'all, that we can do it. I think number one, and it's hard, it's not as easy, but continuing to work around childcare and childcare access and making that really affordable for folks. If you want people to go back to work, and people who want to work, you have to make it so that childcare isn't the same cost as the wages people make. Like that's just that one-to-one is not going to work. So really investing in a world-class 21st century childcare system that's deeply affordable for everyone. I think number two, we have to continue the work we've been doing as a state with EITC, and continue to extend it to more people, and continue to extend it so that it gets to everyone, and that, or at least everyone who needs it. So it's a form of a income floor, a guaranteed income for Californians. I think number three, and Senator Skinner has been leading on this, and I think we should start there and go a little bit broader. This idea of baby bonds, and she has legislation that just passed committee yesterday that speaks to baby bonds for kids who lost parents during COVID, and for foster youth. And I think sort of part of equitable recovery is looking at how do you make sure this next generation, this COVID generation, these kids who spent 2-3 years in Zoom schools with stressed and anxious parents, et cetera, how do you make sure they start adulthood with something, with not $1 million, but something to pay for college, something to pay for housing, something to start a small business. So I think baby bonds has to be part of that conversation. We need some sort of baby bonds or investment. And then as an inland California person, and the former mayor of Stockton, I think we have to have a targeted strategy for the parts of California that were most impacted by COVID regionally. And people don't like me saying this, but we can't leave it up to those local governments to develop that. Because if they had if it's a capacity issue or if it's a compassion issue, for whatever reason, it hasn't happened historically. And there needs to be some help from state players and others to really figure out, okay, for this region, how do we make sure that they don't fall further behind, but that we're actually thinking about integrating them, bringing them into what the state's trying to do, and ensuring that they have opportunities for higher education, for meaningful employment and for recovery. So that's part of the short list. And I know my team is watching, like, you forgot this, 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 and this. And to them, I say, I'm sorry, but those are the things that are top of mind today.
Look, we got 45 more minutes. You're going to get it. You're going to get to everything. So here's a thought, though, picking up on what you said about inland California, because one thing that we know is we have not thought in California, we have not been as intentional about serving inland California as we have the coast. And so I'm wondering what role you think SERF, the Community Economic Resilience Fund that the governor signed last year, can play in rebalancing some of that and in contributing to an economic recovery that starts to have that equity across regions.
Absolutely. I think it's a great first step. I think it's proud of the effort. I think California Forward, in particular, and other groups have been in Go Biz have been really thinking about how to do this. And the only addendum I would say is that as someone who comes from inland California, I think it's more than just leaving the local government officials to come up with the strategy, because if they like the strategy, my assumption is that strategy would, if it was just folks need money for a strategy, this would be amazing. And I think communities like Fresno, that may work because they've been doing a lot of deep organizing and thinking and coalition building for years. But for a lot of communities, I'll take the one I'm from, San Joaquin County. If the governor gave a bunch of money to San Joaquin County, I would say as an 8-year elected official and former mayor, money itself isn't the issue. It's also capacity. It's also technical assistance. It's also expertise about what are sort of the best practices around what economic development looks like in the 21st century. And particularly in these communities, we know that those who govern look very different than those who are like governed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's also about how do we create pathways and process so it's not the same folks who have been making decisions for the past 100 years about particular regions deciding the future, but thinking about what does that process look like where actually like folks who are part of the community who look more like the community are also in positions of government. So I think it's again, easier said than done, but it's necessary because I don't think the issue is just one of resources, although resources is part of it. But I also know, again, from deep experience in doing this work for almost a decade, that even with money, there's also a level of sort of best practices, technical assistance needed, data needed to really point and say, like, I know you've done it this way. Like, for example, the Port of Stockton, maybe this has changed when I was mayor, so many of the revenue or in it was coal, was the transfer of coal across the world through the Port of Stockton. And that coal had terrible impacts on the surrounding community, highest rates of asthma, premature deaths, et cetera, because I mean, it's just coal going through all day, every day. And even in our regional planning efforts for transforming climate community, it was hard to get some leaders to see that no, there's a small trade-off between maybe short-term economic development wins for the few and sort of climate justice, climate goals, but over the long term, this is actually a superior growth strategy. So an extremely long answer to say, I think these are all great first steps, but I am adamant that the resources have to be paired with on the ground technical assistance, on the ground support, on the ground community and coalition building, because, and I'll clear example, the federal government gave a bunch of money to governments to deal with COVID-19 with very broad parameters. You have some communities where the vast majority of that money went to law enforcement. The vast majority of that money went to paying for existing things. Like in more communities than not, none of that money was put to a strategic COVID recovery, strategic COVID. Like in some communities, it was like, we're not going to enforce mask mandates. We're not like we're not going to shelter in place, but we have all this money, and we're going to use this to backfill as general fund revenue. So I'm beating a dead horse here, but I think the idea is that resources have to be paired with like the technical assistance, capacity building to really bring a strategy that the resource can help bring to life.
Okay, no, that makes sense to me. And it sounds like you as mayor would have welcomed that.
Oh, I was always, well, you know how much I used to bug you. I was always like, listen, I don't know everything. I know we need help on this thing. So help me understand the state's role. Like, because the problems are structural and massive and they're not the fault of any one person or institution. So I would have loved, I mean, it would have been hard to get my folks to the table, but I would have got on everyone's nerves like I was known to do anyway, got everyone around the table to say, well,
No
look,
one ever said that about you. No one ever said that.
no one, I'm talking about locally, my friends locally, but we all would have been around the table and we would have been working and kicking and screaming, but thinking about, okay, we have this amazing opportunity. How do we spend this money in a way, or how do we spend this money in a way that helps us transition to green jobs? How do we, but part of it is when you're doing the day-to-day work as well, it's hard to step back and dream. It's hard to step back and picture better because you're just like, I'm trying to deal with the immediate needs. And I think that's why the resources help, but have to be paired with like some facilitation, some technical assistance, some real capacity building to develop a strategy to use the money so the money does what it's supposed to do.
So let me follow up on that, because you have said that kind of creating an inclusive economy depends on kind of challenging long-held assumptions. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the assumptions that you think state and local leaders or employers or folks have that need to be challenged in order to broaden the economic opportunity.
Yeah, and I know it's a through line in all of your work, but I think the underlying assumption has to be the difference in outcomes between groups, between regions, between genders, isn't based off talent and intellect. Like talent and intellect is not the thing that explains these disparate outcomes or the massive income inequality we see in the state or the disparate educational attainment. Like it's resources and opportunities. So I think that's just and it's hard because part of what makes this country so great is this narrative around individualism and agency and effort, which are all important things. I think, but what we have to pivot to is an understanding that because of structural issues, because of policy choices, because of different environments, one's effort will never be enough. Like people are working 2-3 jobs and can't pay rent. People are smart enough to figure out how to make things pencil out at the end of the month without having enough money. Like, so it's the talent and intellect, I think, are equitably distributed. Like you have just as many talented people in South LA as in West Hollywood, and South Stockton as in Brookside, but the resources, opportunities are not. So I think that's a big one. I think number two, this idea that poverty is caused simply by individual choices, or that people are not housed because they're on drugs, or people are not housed because they like living outside in squalor, or people are poor because they need financial management. If they knew how to manage their money, they would have more money. Like all these assumptions that take any responsibility away from the collective, any responsibility away from this entity we give a lot of money to called government, and put it all on a single person. I think we just have to challenge those assumptions. And unfortunately, those assumptions aren't, like, if those assumptions were just partisan, California would look different. But California is all Democrat everything. And even still, we have these persistent problems, those pervasive myths about who's deserving, who's not, who's smart and who's not. What, like, those are deeply ingrained as like American hegemonic thought. And I think that's some of the work we have to really challenge and fight, because we're not going to get to, if the assumption is everything's individual, then you're not going to get to structural solutions. Like, well, it doesn't matter what we do. Like, they're not going to do it. They're lazy, or maybe they're not smart, or maybe they deserve not to have. Maybe there's something about them that makes them less deserving of shelter than me. And I think it's those assumptions we really have to fight with.
So let's talk about EPIC, right? Because we've outlined some of the problems. We've outlined some of the assumptions that people hold. You are now starting something called End Poverty in California. Tell us about it. Tell us why now is the right time for a new anti-poverty initiative.
Yeah, well, part of it came from when I was married on city council, I realized, and this is what led to for us doing the basic income pilot, because I realized all the things we're talking about were really impacts of poverty. Like I'd be in meetings, one meetings about education. It was like 90% of the kids are Title I. And I was like, well, yeah, I mean that like our outcomes then begin to make a little bit more sense. Like, well,
Right.
the schools, I mean, 90% Title I, the neighborhoods aren't great. There's not like, that makes sense. Or we talk about violence and violent crime. And it's like, well, these shootings aren't happening in the more affluent areas. They're happening in the areas with the 90% Title I schools and with higher rates of poverty. Or we'll talk about homelessness. It's like, well, people with money aren't like, it just became very apparent that every issue we talked about was an issue of other things, but baseline poverty being at the core, and really thinking about like, what can we do to do that? And then as I transitioned from mayor and started working with you all in the governor's office, thinking about economic mobility and opportunity, and realizing that part of the issue with mobility, with economic mobility in the state, is that for many people, it's not the first rung. Like poverty robs people of that first step to even get on the ladder.
You get on the ladder.
For a lot of the interventions and supports we do offer. And then I did some research. I remember reading like California has more billionaires than any other country besides the US and China, yet it has a poverty population greater than 31 states. And thinking like there's not a political enemy, because there's like really like not unanimous, but a lot of consensus in terms of political leanings and ideology in our governance. So thinking like, why is it that there's so much poverty in California, the golden state, the liberal state, the progressive state? And that really didn't sit well with me, particularly in the pandemic when I'm seeing these budget surpluses. And I was like, oh my gosh, like 76, like, wow, that means some people have done really well in the pandemic. Good for them, but why is it like more broadly shared? Because I just know a lot of people who aren't doing so well. So long story short, I say, you know what, if we're going to end poverty, then it has to start in California. And because California has the resources, the political temperature, so I think, so part of it is a challenge, because I think even you're one of the few people who've said the name End Poverty in California without like pausing or laughing or saying like, how are you going to do thinking that's such a lofty goal. And I think part of the work we're doing is really going to be on the narrative front in terms of like, you think ending poverty in California is crazy. We think the amount of poverty we have in the state is insane. Like, how do we get towards that? How do we get an evolved understanding of what we can do? That poverty is a solvable problem, and not just a solvable problem, but a problem we should solve. Like that's something that is a good use of our time. And then supporting local counties and cities on pilots. So doing like the unsexy stuff, like thinking about benefits access distribution. And how do we make it so that for all this, because our good friend, the governor, we had a meeting the other week, and he was like, tells we have all this money that we're trying to get to people. Like, how do we make sure people get it? Like, what's making people not access it? So unsexy things like that, in terms of not even doing a bunch of new stuff, but for the stuff we have, how do we make sure the rent relief, the childhood savings accounts, all the things we're doing, how do we make sure it gets to people? And supporting like mayors and counties and others who are thinking about what can we do around poverty. So, and I'll shut up after this, but one of the things I'm excited about is we're working with Speaker Rendon and Chair Assembly Member Bryan on a select committee on poverty for at least the next year to have field hearings and to really shine a light on poverty in the state, and also shine a light as to what are we going to do about it.
And you're doing that all across the state. So it's not just in Sacramento, is that right?
Yeah. So we're doing it all across the state. So we're, LA has an anti-poverty initiative, which includes their guaranteed income pilot, but also other things. So we've been supporting that work. Probably going to be working with a couple counties and again on the benefits distribution access. And then thinking through sort of course in Sacramento, who in the legislature are poverty champions, and how do we elevate their work and help them do what they want to do.
So let me ask, because one of the challenges, I mean, I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned the budget surpluses that the state has had, and the governor's interest in getting, those resources to the people who need them. My question is, what are the best investments for this state to make, given that so much of that money is one-time money, right? Because, you know, poverty is not solved generally with one-time money. So how should the state be thinking about that? What can the state do? Are there certain areas, certain leverage points that the state should be looking at? Or, you know, what does it take?
Yeah, I with the change the GAN limit, I think that's like the big structural thing. But in the interim, I think there's been a lot of smart proposals from groups like the Debt-Free Justice Coalition in terms of, okay, it's one-time money. Why not use this one-time money to eliminate fines and fees for things that keep people trapped in poverty that you could pay off one time and wouldn't really hurt, that aren't necessary. So thinking about fines and fee forgiveness, I think is a good example. And that's one-time money. I think another one is what we've done the past budgets or two is the kind of Golden State stimulus, like just direct rebates to folks. Like, here you go, it's one time, it's not sustaining, but at least this month, this year, this quarter, you'll be able to get through and pay off a bill or pay for the rent. And I think also it provides an opportunity to try and pilot an idea. So it's like, hey, we have this one-time money, so we can't make an ongoing general fund commitment, but let's test something, see what works, and then we can make the case to the legislature and to the voters that this new expenditure is worth it. And then the conversation is, how do we find a way to pay for it? So those would be my 3 recommendations.
Great. You know, when you were mayor, you gained a lot of national recognition for thinking about, or having actually, the first state-funded pilot around universal basic income. And now there are lots of other pilots around the state of California. I'm wondering if you can share with our audience what UBI is and how it's different from guaranteed basic income, and what how we should be thinking about cash support and what that does.
Yeah, so it's been fascinating over the past 5 years just to see where the conversation has gone in a good way. So universal basic income is this idea that as part of the commons, as part of just being a citizen in said democracy or society, that everybody, regardless of income, you could be Bill Gates, you could be Michael Tubbs, you could be whoever, gets a check from the government every month, $1,000, $500, whatever the number is, but it's given to everyone. So that makes it universal. Then guaranteed income says that even if we can't get to everyone, we can make it so we get to everyone who needs it, but make it different than other means-tested programs by providing people the flexibility. And in both of them, the big thing is that people are able to spend the money how they want. Right. It's not a housing voucher. It's not a food voucher. It's a U voucher. Here's money, spend it how you would like. So in Stockton in 2017, we announced we were going to do a guaranteed basic income pilot, with the idea being we couldn't do the whole city, but could we do a representative sample or folks who look like the majority of the city and see what happens. And since then, started a group called Mayors for Guaranteed Income, which has like 75 mayors across the country, 30 of whom are doing pilots as well. We have sort of the Economic Security Project and their work with the community of practice with all these community-based organizations and leaders who are doing their own guaranteed income programs in their communities. And then we had like federal examples. My favorite being the child tax credit, but also the stimulus checks, where folks were just giving money for the government. And I think, Lande, what's been interesting to me is to see when we started in 2017, talked about the concept, it was, can we give people money? And now it's like, who do we give the money to and for how long? And I think it's, for some people, it's like not enough, but for me, that's a huge win, because I didn't think in 5 years we would get to the point where giving money to folks is no longer as controversial. Like, it's not political suicide. It's not controversial. People are like, yeah, should give people money. And now the question is, who do we give it to, for how long, et cetera. Right. And what we saw, and we're going to release our year 2 data in a couple of months, our data of what happened during COVID for the folks in the Stockton program. But what we saw in year 1 was really the opposite of a lot of again, we talked about assumptions, commonly held assumptions. We saw that people didn't spend the money on drugs and alcohol. They spent it on necessities, essentials, like we saw with the stimulus checks and the child tax credit, et cetera. We saw income volatility go down. We saw mental health go up. We saw employment go up, where people were using the money to go from part-time to full-time jobs, or from no employment to part-time employment, or because they were able to pay for things like transportation, caregiving, et cetera.
So, I've been thinking about this outcome around employment. And I think it's huge that you saw full-time employment rise amongst participants. Does that mean the guaranteed basic income is really kind of an employment strategy, or was it designed as an employment strategy?
My research is going to be upset with me because they're like, well, you can't say that conclusively. But I do think what it does suggest is that lack of cash can be an impediment to access for employment. And again, you know better than everyone in terms of what people need to go to work. They need transportation, which costs money.
Right.
They need, cars need maintenance. Even if you have a car, if the transition bus and you're living paycheck to paycheck, you don't have $2,000 and you don't want to go to the check cashing place to pay $4,000 to get the $2,000. Like, is it right? I'm just not gonna go to work. Like, I ain't got it.
Yeah.
You think of like childcare, that costs money. If you're a parent and you're working and you have young children, your kids have to go somewhere. If you don't have a family member who has the flexibility and time to in the generosity of spirit to watch your children for free, you have to pay somebody. So I was actually almost shocked by that one, because I didn't really anticipate it being so drastic, but it makes sense that sort of cash unlocks opportunity and helps remove barriers. And I mean, one person talked about how the $500 a month allowed her to get clothes for her interviews. So she felt like she could interview for these jobs. And someone else who worked as a security guard said he had to stop because he couldn't afford the dry cleaning of the uniform. But the $500 allowed him to pay for dry. He was back at the job with his nice clean uniform because he was like, I can afford to pay. Like, it's like little things like that. And it's like, oh my gosh, like people are locked out, missing out for small amounts of money, which compound over time. But the initial shock is a small expense that folks just don't have the economic resilience to really respond to. And we saw that the basic a guaranteed floor at least helps deal with that, to allow people to again, that first rung on the ladder up. And then last thing I'll say, my favorite examples were those of folks who were working part-time jobs and then moved to full-time, because I was interviewing one. And I was like, well, what'd you do with the money? And he said, I went to an interview. And I was like, no, like everyone told me y'all needed coaching. Like, why would you spend $500 on the interview? Then he started laughing. He said, no, I work hourly. I don't get paid time off. So any hour I'm away from work is an hour of money out of my check. And we live paycheck to paycheck. So I couldn't risk interviewing for a job I think I might get, because I know the guarantee is I'm gonna lose some money. Right. And I have people depending on me. And it was like, that was like so eye-opening. Like, wow, it allowed you to, okay, I can miss a couple hours here and go interview for something better. And then once I get something better, I have benefits, I have stable hours, I have better wages, and I have that job even when that experiment is over, which I think is incredibly powerful and shows how even ongoing is best, but even one-time targeted investments allow people the opportunity to pivot, to position themselves better for ongoing sustainable income sources.
Well, it also speaks to just the rationality of the decision making, right?
Oh yeah, like people are so smart. Like people, like people, right. And that was the other thing. I remember when we were planning the experiment, and I was like listening to people just get a sense. And this is why I became so bullish even before the data was out, because everyone I talked to had a very acute understanding of their finances. They had a very acute understanding of what they wanted to do. And every single one of them had a different answer. And that's why I was like, oh my gosh, like the existing safety net is important. But if you need a housing voucher, you probably need food too. If you need a food voucher, you probably need housing. Like if you're struggling in one area, you're probably struggling in another. And I'm not smart enough to think for all 300,000 people how to spend some money, but folks are. And that was just such a big learning and takeaway.
Right. Well, we're going to transition to audience Q&A shortly. And as a reminder to our audience, please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. But I'm going to ask one more of my 10 remaining questions because I could be here with you for 2 hours. And then we'll make that pivot. You've mentioned a couple of times the care sector. And we know that the care sector was hit really hard during the pandemic. And we know two things to be true. One, it's a much more vital part of how we function as a society than most people ever gave it credit for before the pandemic. And secondly, that it disproportionately employs women and women of color. So can you talk a little bit about, as you think about the work that EPIC is going to do, as you think about the recovery from the economy, what we need to do to improve the care sector in particular?
No, first,
I know it's a big question. Sorry.
No, but I think what the underpinnings of the question are, and we saw this particularly at the federal level when we're talking about Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill versus the human infrastructure bill, and how people could get bridges and roads and stuff, but people couldn't get caregivers that make all work possible. So, I mean, I think I've been talking with our folks at Care Can't Wait in the National Domestic Worker Council and SEIU to really get an understanding as to what are the solutions necessary and needed to really honor this. And there was just even a report, I think, from Cal Matters that talked about how so many people are leaving the childcare space because they're being paid poverty wages. So I think part of it is not professionalizing in the sense of the folks in the industry need to be professionalized, but professionalizing in terms of treating the hard work of taking care of infants and teaching infants and babies as a professional as they are, and sort of raising the floor for them so that they're able to do that work and do it within regular hours and have benefits, et cetera, in doing so. And also sort of providing on-ramps for folks to kind of use that and ladder that to becoming maybe an elementary school teacher or some sort of certification or degree attached to that that's deeply affordable, if not part of a compensation package. I think it makes a lot of sense. No, I think it's just pay overall. Like we know, and again, the math is the math, but we also know that the minimum wage at $15, $16, $17 an hour, you can't live in California off that. You can't rent an apartment anywhere in the state, at least a 2-bedroom with that wage. So we have to think about sort of the nexus as to what people need to survive and what we can afford, but it's a number higher than $15, $16, and it took a lot of work even to get there, right? So I think that's part of it. Yeah, and I think as I do more listening and work, particularly with those sectors, I don't want to be too prescriptive because I haven't developed the expertise I want yet, but I have been spending a lot of time listening and thinking and learning. And I think over the course of the next coming years, you'll see many sort of proposals supported by EPIC or speaking about these things especially because we know that it's women of color who are doing these jobs, and oftentimes because of other structural factors, they're the sole breadwinners of their families or the main breadwinners of their family, and important to keep those considerations in mind when we think about compensation, when we think about job quality, when we think about worker conditions.
Let's go to the first audience question that we have, which is this. Could you speak to the statement from the Urban Institute? To ensure solutions are moving in the right direction, policymakers can evaluate proposals through the equity lens the Biden administration and others have proposed. What are some examples of using an equity lens to evaluate proposals that you've seen or would like the government, city, county, state, or federal, to try?
Yeah, I think the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley has such a good sort of equity impact analysis framework and really thinking about, in terms of bureaucracy and policy, how do we make sure that when we're implementing something or proposing something, we're keeping in mind disparate impact, and we're keeping in mind sort of, even if there's a similar problem, that similar problem may have different causes for different groups, which may necessitate different solutions. So to answer the question, I think the Othering Belonging Institute and the work John Powell is doing is sort of my North Star in terms of doing this. I think PolicyLink does amazing work sort of in this space, and have like frameworks that help people look at things through an equity lens. But what I found in my work in Stockton is that part of the difficulty of implementing that was that a lot of folks in these positions didn't know what equity was, and thought like equity, like we got to treat everyone the same, like that's equity. Like so I think it's also beyond the framework. It's really educating those in charge of public resources and the public benefit on sort of what we mean when we say equity, and why treating people differently in the case of equity considerations isn't a bad thing and isn't a step backwards, but it's actually what's necessary to bring about the outcomes we all want to see.
So let me ask a follow-up to that, because you actually serve in an ex officio capacity on the Governor's Council for Economic Advisors. Are there equity-based strategies that are being discussed there that responded to the pandemic, or that are being proposed to address economic mobility?
I think, I think there have been discussions, particularly using a gender equity lens and thinking about the pandemic through the lens of women and women of color. And because of the diversity of the Economic Council, we have some economists who really focus on sort of the economy and how it relates to folks of color and disparate outcomes, but that's not everyone's frame. So I think part of it is, as we drill down as to our agenda, like what we want to focus on, which is still a work in progress, that infusing that as part of every conversation. So long answer to say, I think some of it's there, but I'm not sure as a whole, every conversation we have is through that lens, because everyone's just approaching it from their own different disciplines. And some folks will say, well, I'm a labor economist, I focus on this things broadly. And not everyone is at the point where it's like, well, no matter what you study, particularly in California, you're talking about people of color, because that's just the state. So definitely have some work to do there. But I would also say there's no resistance to that work. It's just sort of a muscle memory and making that just part of the ongoing practice. Now, also, I've missed the last two meetings. So if so for those of y'all watching, I'm not shading us. We're doing good work. And then I'm sure the last two meetings, we've begun to accelerate that work.
That's great. Another audience question is, what does success look like in having an equitable recovery? And what are the specific indicators that you would look at to gauge how well California is doing?
Y'all smart questions. Like this is like it's supposed to be easy. No, I think that there's a group, and I'm going to butcher their name, but I just came out with this sort of framework talking about looking at the economy through the outcomes of those who do some of the most essential work, but have some of the worst outcomes in terms of Black women. So in California, it would probably be Black women, but in terms of numbers, also Latino women, and kind of looking at their outcomes. So for me, part of a successful recovery would be those outcomes being not the same as they were before the pandemic, but better in terms of employment, in terms of income, et cetera. I think sort of another indicator for me would be the poverty rate. The poverty rate should be lower than it was before the pandemic. For me, a recovery isn't just get to where you were right before you were sick. But the recovery is like, let's get to the best health you've ever been. So I think looking at those would be my three or two, sort of employment, unemployment rates, and wage growth for Black and Latino women, and poverty rate. and maybe child poverty rate under that. Those would be the indicators I look at as to how California is doing, in addition to the other things like GDP, job creation, et cetera. Yeah.
So another audience question is, are there things you're able to do as an anti-poverty advocate that you weren't able to do while in elected office?
Absolutely. I can talk freely. Which is funny because everyone's like, well, you didn't talk freely before. I was like, no, that was me constrained. But
wow, I just have to say, wow.
I think, but no, but I was in all seriousness, I think what I'm able to do now, I have time to think. Like I have time to step back and brainstorm and dream. I have time to listen. I have time to go across the state. And as we've been doing listening tours throughout the state, I was able to spend an afternoon at Compton Community College and just listen to community college students and like, wow. You knew this. I didn't know the housing crisis we have with community college students. Because you think like, well, hey, they had, because most community college students aren't 18, 19. They're like, and that was just a whole reframe for me. I was like, oh my God. I'm sure
Keith Carson like bombarded you with information about that.
So that, and then we were in Fresno, and I spent an evening listening to immigration activists who schooled me on the intersections of undocumented folks in poverty and how a poverty strategy in California has to keep undocumented folks in line because they're in families and they have children and they're part of the economy. And if their economic health doesn't improve, the state's economic health, the families they come from. So just being able to do that and to like focus on one issue and not have to be and I don't have to be so reactive. I don't have to respond to everything. I don't have to respond to the news of the day. I don't have to respond to this controversy. I don't have to respond to this. I don't have to spend time hearing complaints. I don't have to. It's just the freedom of time and the ability to think and to dream and like a push. And then I was telling the governor this the other day. I was like, well, because I said something to him and he had all these reasons. I said, well, listen, boss, your job is to implement. I am now the ideas guy. This is what we should do. I'm happy to help you figure out, but I know that's not in my scope or job description. So like, go ahead. Like you're saying that's good because before I would have to come up with ideas and then figure out how to implement them, which is harder.
That's hilarious. I'm sure he appreciated that. So we have an audience question from a good friend, Lenny Mendonça, who describes himself as retired, sort of.
No.
If you could expand or extend EITC, what would be your first few priorities? Treating students, caregivers, whether paid or as not as eligible?
Yeah, I would make the eligibility sort of zero. Like there's no income requirement. There would be no income requirement for me, just to make sure that students and caregivers are taken care of. I would but this is a tech issue, but make sure we're able to make the payments monthly versus kind of the one-time lump sum. I would also add a added bonus for more folks, but for the same folks who qualified for the federal program, the child tax credit. I would make that eligibility for folks in California, as California step in and provide that for Californians, even though the federal government couldn't. And I would also include undocumented folks, which I know we're doing, or we've talked. Now I think this budget we're doing that for EITC.
Okay. Another audience question: the future of work is an idea that is talked about a lot. How do you think the future of work in California? How do you think about the future of work in California and how the pandemic may have changed work in long-term ways?
I think the future of work in California is actually about the future of workers, right? I think that when we talk about the future of work, we're talking about the people who are doing the job. And for me, I center the people versus industry. And I think that we again, particularly with all the changes we see on the horizon with technological advancement, automation, like if we don't get certain things right now, it's going to be even worse in the future. So we have to have a conversation about gig workers, gig economy, and sort of what are the protections that they need and benefits. So we have to have a conversation with everybody, labor, industry, et cetera, about what do portable benefits look like? Because the gig economy isn't going anywhere, and people are going to need benefits that travel with them in the different sort of jobs they do. We're going to have to talk about sort of like where the base, like for workers in California, what's the baseline things they need? Like, I don't think any worker should not have some level of paid time off. I just do not understand how, in a world so volatile, we don't have, like, people don't have the ability to take a hour off to pick up a sick kid from school,
Yeah.
a day off to take care of themselves or take care of it. Like that just seems almost barbaric to me. So I think we have to have a really clear definition of, as we think about the future of workers in California, what are some of the baseline protections that all workers need? And then three, and to your point, we also have to talk about sort of the future workforce. Like, what are we doing now, particularly for these kids who lost 2 years of schooling, 2 years of socialization? What are we doing now to prepare them for the jobs of the future, to take those jobs? And we also realized that 5% of workers were remote before the pandemic, but it'll be 25% of workers moving forward. So how do we make sure folks have the space they need to work at school remotely, in terms of just a room to do so? So I think all of those are the big considerations in terms of what the future work will look like in California.
Great. One question I want to ask you is, on our latest PPIC statewide survey, nearly half of Californians with annual incomes of under $40,000 are saying that rising prices, higher prices, are causing them some economic hardship. And I'm wondering what you think the state should be doing right now to blunt the impact of higher prices. Is it, do we need some kind of gas tax rebate? Like, what is it that we should be doing right now?
Yeah, I think we have to find a way to, in the short term, give people some sort of relief, but make sure that relief is equitable in terms of to all the people who we know who need it the most, right? And graduated from there.
So means tested?
Yeah, I would be in favor of, if not means tested, things that are just more targeted. So I get the sort of need to do something around rising gas prices as a policy matter, but mostly as a political matter, right? Like that's a political thing. People are talking about, people are upset. No matter their gas is, I don't like $6 gas. Like that makes me mad. but I'm not like, my hands aren't trembling and I'm not putting going to the Coinstar to count these pennies to do so. So I can only imagine. But so I say that to say that there has to be, like, the gas rebate solves a particular problem for a wide swath of the population. But for folks here less, that's just yes, we have to think about, again, like direct cash to the folks that are able to do what they need to do for their families. Did I freeze?
You froze, but I think we got you back.
Okay.
Okay, so I know we're going to have to close out our program in just a minute. So I want to close asking you one question, which is, at the end of the day, we are in, another unique moment here for California. It's been a challenging time for the state, for the nation, now for the world. As you look at the future, what gives you hope?
I am most hopeful by, all the assumptions about what COVID-19 would do, they haven't borne out. Like, I was worried, like, wow, like folks are going to be left behind. Like we spend a lot of time talking about the issues, but I'm actually surprised it's not worse. I am so proud of the way, particularly as a state, we've thought about, okay, rental relief, utility relief, direct cash to people, like we've been thinking about what do we do to make sure our folks aren't harmed unduly by this pandemic. And I'm also hopeful by, again, the conversations I get to have with people, like people who are facing the brunt of a lot of these issues, who are still hopeful that government can deliver, who are still hopeful that things will be better for their children, who are still hopeful that tomorrow will be different and tomorrow will be better. And I think for me, that's just so motivating in terms of, well, wow, if you haven't given up, who am I to? If you still think this can work, like who am I not with the opportunity to actually do something or at least be part of the conversations and push? And I think also like the arc of history makes me very hopeful, particularly as a Black person in this country, just thinking about how the ways things definitely aren't perfect, but how folks with less resources, less opportunity, less agency than me found a way to push us forward and push us to the point now where I was talking to somebody about like all the issues and problems. And I said, but I would rather be born with my same identity when I was born than any time before, which is a sad indictment on history, but also something to be optimistic for, not because we've arrived, but because we're always in pursuit of the destination. We can always do more and do better. And people did it with less. So those are the things that keep me hopeful.
Well, thank you for not just the hope, but the inspiration that you've provided for all of us. Thank you for your work on behalf of all people, on behalf of people of color, on behalf of people in the state who are struggling and are in search of the agency, the freedom, the opportunity that you've mentioned. And thank you mostly for joining us today. We really appreciate having you.
Well, thank you. It felt like a interview for a tenure track professorship. And then I had to think. So I appreciate that. I couldn't just talk. I was like, no, let me think. That's a good question.
I will always be your thought partner. So let me know if I can help.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay. Talk soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our program, and I would like to thank you for joining us today. And I also want to thank our sponsors. And finally, thanks again to Mayor Michael Tubbs. I hope you'll be able to join us on Tuesday, April 26th at 10 a.m., where we'll have a panel focused on infrastructure in the state of California called Building California's Future, featuring 3 distinguished guests. Secretary Toks Omishakin, who is the new secretary of the California State Transportation Agency, Danny Wan, who is the executive director of the Port of Oakland, and Mayor Aquanetta Warren from the city of Montana. If you pre-registered for today's event, later you will receive a survey, and we hope you'll take a couple of minutes to fill it out and let us know how you liked the program. Thanks again for joining us. Please be safe and have a great day.